You think you've finally escaped it. You pack your bags, move into the woods, and buy a small piece of land. You tell yourself, this is it. No more prying neighbors, no more committee letters about grass height, and certainly no more HOA telling you what shade of beige your front door has to be. That's what I thought. I thought I was safe, but then one morning I opened my mailbox, and there it was, a letter with an official HOA header. The paper felt heavier than it should have, and at the bottom of that cold, bureaucratic text was a number. Not just a number, a fine. $19,000 for my cabin, a cabin that wasn't even in their jurisdiction. Now, before I tell you how that nightmare unfolded, let me take you back. I'd always dreamed of having a cabin in the woods. Nothing fancy, just a place of my own, a little hideaway where the noise of the world couldn't reach me. I spent years saving, cutting corners, sacrificing vacations, all for the day I could finally claim my own slice of quiet. When I found it, it was perfect. 5 acres right on the edge of a forest preserve. No gates, no subdivisions. Just open sky, tall pines, and a creek that shimmered at dawn. I built the cabin with my own hands. Learned as I went. Hammer in one hand, blueprint in the other. Stubborn enough to figure it out even when I had no clue what I was doing. By the time smoke curled from the chimney and I sat on the porch watching deer graze at sunrise, I felt like I had carved out a piece of freedom itself. But freedom has enemies. And they come dressed as authority. The first letter from the HOA arrived in spring. It was worded like a judgment. You are in violation of Article 7. Section 3. Unauthorized structure built without design approval. I laughed when I read it. Unauthorized. Design approval. What design approval do you need when your land doesn't even touch theirs? I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash. That was my mistake, because a month later, another letter came. Not a warning, this time an invoice. A fine? $500. Now, I've dealt with HOAs before. And if you've ever had the misfortune, you know their game. They start small. A fine here, a late fee there. They count on you ignoring it, because then they can stack penalties, interest, administrative costs, until suddenly you're drowning. But this time, I wasn't ignoring it out of laziness. I was ignoring it because it didn't make sense. My deed didn't list them. My land wasn't part of their subdivision. I didn't pay dues, didn't attend meetings, didn't vote. I didn't belong to them, so I called. That's when I met Margaret. She was the president of the HOA. And if you can imagine the word HOA shaped into a person, that was her. Clipped sentences. Permanent frown. She spoke like every word cost her time and patience. Sir, she said, your cabin falls within the extended boundary of our association. You are subject to its rules. I told her no. I told her I checked the maps, the surveys, the deed. My property was separate, but she laughed. A quick, dismissive laugh, like she'd heard it all before. And then she said something that stuck with me. We have ways of handling non-compliance. By summer, the fines had grown like mold. 500 became 3,000. Then 7. Every envelope was thicker, every number larger. And the line items. Ridiculous, unapproved roofing material. Failure. To landscape front yard. Unauthorized outbuilding. They even fined me for the color of my shutters. I didn't even have shutters at first. It was almost funny. But the laughter stopped when the number hit $19,000. I'd sit at my cabin table at night. Bills spread out like some sick deck of cards. Wondering if maybe I should just pay something, anything, just to make it stop. That's how they get you. They grind you down until you give in. But then I heard my grandfather's voice in my head. He used to say, never pay a bully. They'll only come back hungry for more. So I decided, not $1. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. I started digging. I drove to the county recorder's office, pulled up maps, deeds, survey lines, historical records. And what I found was the smoking gun. My land had never been annexed into their association. Not once. My deed went back generations, and every line said the same thing. I was outside their jurisdiction, so why were they so confident? Why were they acting like they owned me? That question haunted me until I stumbled across a file buried deep in the county archives. A boundary adjustment petition filed 5 years earlier. By Margaret herself. The petition requested that the HOA absorb additional land into its authority. Land that included my property. But here's the kicker. The petition had been denied. The county had shut it down, which meant the HOA had no power. None. They knew it. They just didn't care. So all those fines? Bogus. Every single one. It wasn't just harassment. It was fraud. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about my cabin anymore. If they tried this on me, how many others had they bullied into paying? How many neighbors wrote checks they didn't owe just to make the harassment stop? I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building a case. A weapon. I gathered everything, letters, notices that denied petition, even recordings of my phone calls with Margaret. And when the day finally came to walk into SEF's, that HOA board meeting with a folder full of evidence, I knew one thing. The look on their faces was going to be worth far more than $19,000. But what I didn't know was that this battle was just beginning. Because once I confronted them, a fight wasn't going to stay in their boardroom. It was going to court. Asterisk, asterisk. I'll never forget the night of that board meeting. The air was heavy with summer heat. The kind that clings to your skin even after the sun dips below the horizon. The HOA clubhouse sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, all beige stucco and polished brass letters on the sign outside. A building that screamed order and conformity. The kind of place that smelled like disinfectant and fear. I walked in with a folder tucked under my arm. Inside it were deeds, maps, county records, and that golden ticket, the denied petition that proved Margaret and her board had no authority over me. I wasn't nervous. I was angry. The meeting room was already packed. Folding chairs lined up in rows, homeowners fanning themselves with pamphlets. And up front, the board members sat behind a long table like royalty, lording over their subjects. And at the center, presiding over it all like a judge, sat Margaret. Her eyes found me the second I walked in, cold, sharp. She adjusted her glasses and whispered something to the man next to her. When my name came up on the agenda, she leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. Walker, we're here to discuss your continued violations and your refusal to comply with association rules. You've accrued fines totaling $19,000. Do you intend to settle your account tonight?" I stood, pulled the folder from under my arm, and laid it on the podium. I didn't raise my voice, didn't rant. I just spoke clearly, the way you do when you know the truth is on your side. "My property," I said, "is not under your jurisdiction. It never has been. And I have proof." I opened the folder, pulling out the maps, the deed, the surveyor's notes. Homeowners in the audience leaned forward, whispering to each other as I held up document after document. And then, with deliberate care, I pulled out the petition, the one Margaret filed 5 years ago. "This," I said, "is a record of your attempt to annex my land. And this," I added, pointing to the bold red stamp across the page, "is the county's denial. You knew this entire time you had no authority over my property. But you fined me anyway." The room fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Margaret's face went pale, then flushed red. She snatched up her microphone and tried to speak, but the murmurs from the audience grew louder. Neighbors turned to one another, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger. Some pulled out their phones, snapping pictures of the documents I laid on the table. "You've been stealing from us," a man in the back shouted. "Yeah," another voice chimed in. "How many of these fines are even real?" The board squirmed in their seats. One of them, a balding man with a mustache, tried to gavel the room into order, but the noise only grew. Margaret finally raised her voice, sharp and commanding. "Mr. Walker is mistaken. These records are being misinterpreted." "This meeting is not the proper venue, too," I cut her off. "The proper venue? Fine. Then we'll take it to court." I gathered my papers, slid them back into the folder, and walked out, leaving the room buzzing with voices, questions, and anger aimed squarely at the board. That night, I sat on my porch, listening to the crickets sing in the woods. For the first time in months, I felt lighter. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But it wasn single quotes, because when you expose people like that, they don't just back down. They fight dirtier. The next week, I got a letter. Not another fine this time. A legal notice. The HOA was filing a lien against my property. Now, if you've never dealt with a lien, let me tell you, it's their nuclear option. A lien means they're claiming you owe money, and until you pay, they can cloud the title to your property. You can't refinance. You can't sell. In some cases, they can even foreclose. But here's the thing, they can only file a valid lien if they actually have legal authority over your property. And mine? They didn't. Still, there it was, filed, recorded at the county. They were escalating, betting that the weight of the legal system would crush me before I could fight back. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the notice. My anger had turned into something colder. Determination. If they wanted a legal fight, they were going to get one. I called a lawyer the next morning. His name was Granta Sharp. No-nonsense kind of guy with the patience of a saint and the bite of a wolf when it came to cases like mine. He listened as I laid out everything: the letters, the fines, the board meeting, the denied petition. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Mr. Walker," he said, "you've got them. This isn't just a defense. This is a lawsuit." And so it began. Grant filed suit against the HOA, accusing them of fraud, harassment, and abuse of power. He attached the petition, the denial, the fines, and the lien. He asked the court not just to void the lien, but to hold the board personally accountable. Word spread fast. The homeowners who had sat in that meeting started talking. Whispers turned into stories. More and more neighbors came forward with their own tales of bizarre fines, bullying letters, and threats. Some even admitted they'd paid thousands because they didn't think they had a choice. Suddenly, it wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's. And Margaret? She wasn't taking it well. I'd see her sometimes, driving slowly past my cabin in her shiny SUV, her eyes fixed on the porch where I sat drinking coffee. Like she wanted me to know she was watching. Other times, anonymous notes would show up in my mailbox, cowardly little threats scrawled on notebook paper. But the intimidation only hardened my resolve. Every note, every glare, every underhanded move made me more certain. They weren't just overreaching. They were scared, and scared people make mistakes. As the court date approached, my lawyer and I dug deeper. We subpoenaed financial records, HOA budgets, meeting minutes. And what we found was worse than we imagined. The board had been padding the budget with miscellaneous enforcement fees, a slush fund built on bogus fines, tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. Homeowners were essentially bankrolling Margaret's little empire, paying for her pet projects and administrative expenses. It was corruption, plain and simple. The day of the hearing finally came. The courthouse was packed. Homeowners, board members, reporters who'd caught wind of the story. Margaret sat at the defense table, her lips pressed into a tight line, flanked by a team of attorneys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. When my lawyer stood and presented the petition, the denied petition, it was like dropping a bomb in the room. The judge leaned forward, studying the document, then turned his gaze to the HOA's lawyers. "Is this accurate?" he asked. The lawyers shuffled papers, avoided eye contact, muttered excuses, and for the first time, I saw it. Fear in Margaret's eyes. Not the kind of fear you get from losing a battle. The kind that comes from realizing the war is already lost. The judge slammed his gavel. Until further notice, all fines and liens against Mr. Walker are suspended. This court will review the plaintiff's claims of fraudulent enforcement. The board tried to spin it as a minor setback, but the damage was done. Their credibility was shattered. The neighbors knew. The court knew. And soon, the whole town would know. I walked out of that courtroom into the sunlight, the weight on my chest finally lifting. But deep down, I understood something. This wasn't over. I had won the first round, sure. But Margaret and her board weren't the type to slink away quietly. They'd fight tooth and nail to protect their little kingdom. And I was ready, because this wasn't about $19,000 anymore. This was about exposing them for what they truly were. Asterisk, asterisk. The morning after that first court hearing, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Messages poured in, neighbors, coworkers, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. Word had spread fast. "Did you really take the HOA to court? Man, you've got guts. Tell me you're gonna win this thing." And then there were the homeowners from my so-called extended boundary. Some I barely knew. Some I'd waved to in passing at the gas station. But now, suddenly, they were allies. Their voices carried the same mix of anger and relief I'd felt when I found that denied petition. One woman told me she'd paid nearly $6,000 in unapproved exterior paint fines, even though she had a letter from the builder showing the color was pre-approved. Another man said he'd been fined for a broken fence he didn't even own. It was the county's fence, not his. The pattern was clear. Margaret and her board had been running a racket for years, preying on fear and ignorance. And the homeowners. They were tired of it. That week, we held our own meeting. Not in the HOA clubhouse, not under their fluorescent lights and fake smiles. We gathered at a neighbor's barn, sitting on hay bales and folding chairs, the air thick with the smell of hay and motor oil. And one by one, people shared their stories. By the time the last person spoke, the anger in the room was hot enough to burn the walls down. "This isn't just about Walker," one man said, his fists clenched at his sides. "It's about all of us. We've been robbed." I told them the truth. This was bigger than fines. It was fraud. And fraud meant criminal charges were possible. Eyes widened, jaws tightened. For the first time, people realized Margaret and her board weren't untouchable. The barn echoed with something I hadn't heard in a long time. Hope. But hope has a way of attracting enemies. 2 nights later, I came home to find tire tracks across my driveway and my mailbox smashed into pieces. A crude message was spray-painted on the side of my cabin. "Drop IT." I stood there in the moonlight, staring at the dripping letters, and for the first time, I felt the weight of what I'd started. This wasn't just paperwork in courtrooms anymore. It was personal. Someone wanted to scare me into silence, but fear cuts 2 ways. It can break you, or it can harden you. I chose the latter. The next morning, I filed a police report. The officer, a grizzled veteran with a handlebar mustache, shook his head as he scribbled notes. "Sounds like somebody's nervous," he said. "You keep pushing. You're gonna rattle the right cage." That was exactly what I intended. When our second court date rolled around, the HOA's lawyers tried a new tactic. They argued that even if my property wasn't technically in their jurisdiction, still benefited from the association's services. Roads, snow removal, security patrols. It was a desperate move on. My lawyer tore it apart. "Your Honor," Grant said, holding up the survey map, "Mr. Walker's property sits entirely outside the maintained areas of the association. He pays for his own access road, his own snow plowing. He has never requested nor received a single service from the HOA to suggest otherwise is a deliberate misrepresentation." The judge raised an eyebrow at the HOA's table. "Do you have evidence to the contrary?" Silence. Their lawyers shuffled papers, glanced at Margaret, then shook their heads. Strike two. But the real blow came when financial documents were introduced. Those miscellaneous enforcement fees. They were more than a slush fund. They were practically embezzlement. Tens of thousands of dollars funneled into vague administrative costs, special projects, and community enhancement initiatives. The paper trail led straight to Margaret and her inner circle. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Grant laid out the numbers. The judge's face hardened. "This court," he said, "is deeply concerned with the conduct of this association. These matters may extend beyond civil liability." Margaret's hands gripped the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. For the first time, she looked small. The homeowner sitting behind me erupted in quiet cheers when the judge adjourned. It felt like victory was within reach. But victory has a strange way of slipping through your fingers just when you think you've got it. Because the very next day, Margaret resigned. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a tactical retreat. She stepped down for personal reasons, passing the torch to her vice president, a slippery man named Douglas, who had the smile of a used car salesman and the ethics to match. Douglas wasted no time shifting the blame. He went door to door, telling neighbors Margaret had acted alone, that the board was as much a victim as anyone. He promised transparency reforms, a new era of fairness. Some people bought it. They wanted to believe the nightmare was over. But others saw through the act, and me. I knew better. Because Douglas wasn't just Margaret's second in command. He was her enforcer. The muscle behind her schemes. If Margaret was the queen, Douglas was the executioner. I told Grant, she's playing chess. She stepped down to protect herself. Now Douglas takes the heat, and she walks away clean. He nodded grimly. Maybe, but we're not done yet. We kept pressing. Subpoenas went out. More documents surfaced. The deeper we dug, the darker it got. There were whispers of kickbacks from contractors, inflated invoices. Even hush money paid to a former board member who'd threatened to blow the whistle. It wasn't just corruption, was organized corruption. A machine built to squeeze every last dime out of homeowners. And the worst part? For years, it had worked. Now with Margaret in the shadows and Douglas out front, the machine was limping, but not dead. They were wounded. Yes, but a wounded animal is often the most dangerous. One night, as I locked up the cabin, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. A car idled at the edge of my driveway, headlights off, just sitting there, watching. I stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, until the engine finally revved and the car disappeared into the night. I didn't sleep much after that. But I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when we were this close. The next court date loomed, and this time it wasn't just about voiding fines or liens. This was about accountability. Criminal accountability. The kind of thing that didn't just end with a gavelette, ended with handcuffs, and, as I looked at the stack of evidence piled high on my kitchen table, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The HOA thought they could fine me $19,000 into submission. Instead, they'd unleashed something they couldn't control. And the next round? It was going to get ugly. Asterisk, the weeks leading up to the next hearing felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. You could sense it in the air, the unease, the tension. The way neighbors looked over their shoulders when Douglas's name came up in conversation. Douglas wasn't Margaret. He didn't hide behind paperwork and technical jargon. He was bold, aggressive, the kind of man who believed intimidation could win any argument. And the moment he took the presidency, he turned the screws tighter. Letters went out again, not to me this time, but to others. Petty fines for overgrown grass, unauthorized basketball hoops. A child's swing set supposedly violating community standards. It was the same game, but nastier. Some of the homeowners folded, paying just to avoid the headache. Others resisted, emboldened by my fight. Douglas made sure to target the loudest voices. He wanted to silence the troublemakers, make examples out of them. And at the top of his list was a man named Harris. Harris was a retired veteran, the kind of guy who stood straight even at 70. He'd lived in the neighborhood longer than most, and he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. At that barn meeting, he was the one who declared, "We've been robbed." 2 weeks later, he got slapped with nearly $4,000 in fines. They claimed his shed was unauthorized, even though it had been standing for over a decade. I drove over to his place one evening and found him sitting on his porch. The letter crumpled in his fist, his face red with anger. "They think I'm scared," he said. Voice steady, but laced with fury. They picked the wrong man. I looked at him and saw what this fight had become. It wasn't just me anymore. It was an army, one growing stronger with every abuse the HOA tried to dish out. But Douglas wasn't finished. A few days later, homeowners started finding flyers in their mailboxes. Anonymous, but the tone was unmistakable. I was the villain. According to the flyers, I was costing the community thousands in legal fees. I was disruptive, selfish, tearing the neighborhood apart. Classic smear tactics. Divide and conquer. Some people wavered. I could see it in their eyes when we passed at the gas station or grocery store. Doubt, fear. What if he really is just making this worse for all of us? But others stood firmer than ever. Harris, the woman with the paint fines. The younger families tired of being bullied. They weren't buying Douglas's lies. Still, I knew one thing. The smear campaign meant we were hitting close to the bone. They were desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. Meanwhile, the investigation was heating up. The county prosecutor had taken an interest, thanks to the evidence my lawyer had uncovered. Financial records, falsified budgets, hush payments. What began as a civil case was starting to look a lot like a criminal one. Grant and I sat in his office one afternoon. The blinds drawn, papers spread across the desk. He tapped one document with his pen. "Look here," he said. "These payments to a landscaping company. They don't add up. The invoices are inflated, and guess who signed off on every single one?" I didn't have to guess. Margaret, even though she'd resigned, her fingerprints were all over the mess. Douglas might be the face now, but she was still in the shadows, pulling strings. "They're not just mismanaging funds," Grant continued. "They're laundering money, paying contractors double and pocketing the difference." I sat back, the weight of it settling in. This wasn't petty HOA nonsense anymore. This was criminal enterprise. And yet, despite the mountain of evidence, Douglas strutted around like he owned the place. He even had the nerve to show up at my cabin one Saturday afternoon. I was stacking firewood when his SUV pulled up, dust swirling around the tires. He stepped out, wearing a crisp polo shirt, sunglasses, and that smug grin plastered across his face. "Walker," he said, hands on his hips. "You think you've won something here? You haven't. You're costing everyone money. Neighbors are turning on you. You'd be smart to drop this before it gets uglier." I set down the axe and wiped sweat from my brow. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't give him the satisfaction. "Douglas, I said. "You've already lost. You just don't know it yet." For a second, the smile faltered. His jaw tightened and he leaned in closer. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, before turning on his heel and climbing back into the SUV. The tires spun gravel as he roared off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. I stood there, axe in hand, heart pounding but resolve like steel. If there had been any doubt before, it was gone now. Douglas wasn't bluffing. He was threatening me, but he just made his biggest mistake yet, because intimidation only works if you let it. And I wasn't about to. The next hearing was the most intense yet. The courtroom was packed tighter than before. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls. Reporters had their cameras ready, pens scribbling notes. Douglas sat at the defense table, sweating through his shirt, while Margaret was conspicuously absent. Too dangerous for her to show her face now, Grant presented the evidence like a master, craftsman laying each piece down one by one until the picture was undeniable. Inflated invoices, fake fines, the denied petition, and then the kicker, a whistleblower. Remember that board member who'd taken hush money? He came forward. Under oath, he testified that Margaret and Douglas had orchestrated the entire scheme. He admitted they'd bullied him into silence, paying him off when he threatened to expose their corruption. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, whispers. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but the damage was already done. Douglas sat frozen, his face drained of color. For once, he had no smirk, no swagger. Just silence. The judge leaned forward, his tone grave. "This case will proceed to criminal review. The allegations presented here today raise serious concerns of fraud, misappropriation of funds, and potential racketeering. This court cannot ignore such evidence." Racketeering. The word hung in the air like a THUNDERCLAP. When the hearing adjourned, the room erupted into chaos. Neighbors hugged me, reporters shoved microphones in my face, and Douglas slipped out the back like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. That night, I sat on my porch again, staring at the stars above the tree line. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, I felt like justice was within reach. The HOA had started this war by fining me $19,000 for a war cabin they had no claim to. They thought they could bully me into submission. Instead, they'd expose themselves for what they were. And as the criminal investigation moved forward, one thing was certain. Margaret and Douglas weren't just fighting me anymore. They were fighting the law. But I also knew something else. Cornered animals are the most dangerous. And they weren't done lashing out. Not yet. Asterisk, the days after the last hearing felt electric, like the town itself was holding its breath. For years, the HOA had ruled unchecked, their fines and threats treated as gospel. But now, the mask had slipped. People saw them for what they were. Neighbors who once whispered in fear now spoke loudly. At the diner, at the gas station, even in the church parking lot, the talk was all the same. How could they do this to us? How much money did they steal? How long have we been played? For the first time, the board wasn't feared. They were despised, and yet, that shift brought its own kind of danger. Because when tyrants lose their grip, they don't go quietly. They claw, they bite, they scramble for every ounce of control left. Douglas, especially. He may have been cornered in court, but out in the community, he doubled down. He stormed through board meetings, shouting about loyalty. Accusing anyone who questioned him of siding with Walker, he pushed through emergency assessments, demanding each homeowner pay hundreds to cover legal expenses. The backlash was immediate. People refused. Checks bounced. Mailboxes filled with angry letters instead of payments. Some homeowners flat out told him to his face, "We're not paying another dime." The pressure cooker was about to blow. Meanwhile, The prosecutor's office had officially opened a criminal investigation. Detectives knocked on doors, asking questions, collecting documents. Homeowners handed over years of letters, invoices, receipts, a paper trail of abuse stretching back further than anyone realized. The deeper they dug, the uglier it got. Kickbacks from landscaping companies, ghost contracts with non-existent maintenance crews, HOA funds paying for lavish dinners, vacations, even a new deck on Margaret's private lake house. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was theft, systematic, calculated. When news of that leaked, the community turned into a powder keg. One evening, I drove past the HOA clubhouse and saw a crowd gathered outside. Neighbors shouting, holding signs they'd scribbled with markers. Where's our money? Board equals crooks. Enough is enough. Douglas tried to quiet them, stepping onto the porch with a bullhorn. But the jeers drowned him out. People weren't listening anymore. The board had lost its authority. That should have been the turning point, the moment things finally began to heal. But instead, it was when the fight took its darkest turn. I came home late that night, a headlight sweeping across my cabin's driveway. And that's when I saw it. My windows shattered. My front door splintered open. Inside, chaos. Furniture overturned. Drawers dumped. Papers scattered, but nothing of value was missing. Not my tools. Not my laptop. Not the cash I kept in a safe. Whoever had done this wasn't there to steal. They were sending a message. On the wall, scrawled in black spray paint, were 3 words. Back. O.F. Now. I stood there, heart pounding, the stench of paint burning my nose. This wasn't HOA politics anymore. This was war. I called the sheriff's department. Deputies came out, flashlights cutting through the night, snapping photos, jotting notes. One of them, a young officer with tired eyes, muttered, "Looks like someone doesn't like what you're digging up." "No kidding," I said. But even as I swept up glass the next morning, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't back off. Not now. Not when they'd gone this far. If anything, it only fueled me at the next community gathering. I held up the photos of my vandalized cabin for everyone to see. Gasps rippled through the barn. Anger turned into resolve. They think this will scare us, I told them. They think breaking windows will shut us up. But they're wrong. This isn't about one cabin. It's about all of us. Every dollar they stole. Every threat they made. Every family they bullied. We either fight together or we stay victims forever. The room erupted in applause. People who had once kept their heads down now stood tall. Harris, the retired vet, slammed his fist on the table and growled. "Then, let's finish this." From that moment, the tide shifted completely. Homeowners began organizing. They filed petitions to dissolve the board. They created a watchdog group, collecting and sharing every piece of shady history they could find. The local news picked it up, splashing headlines across the front page. HOA fraud investigation expands. Douglas tried to hold on. But it was like trying to dam a river with his bare hands. His voice at meetings was drowned out by chance. His emergency assessments went unpaid. His allies on the board started to jump ship, resigning one by one until only a skeleton crew remained. But Douglas wasn't the kind of man to go down with dignity. The night before our biggest court date yet, I got another warning. This time, not at my cabin, at Harris's. He called me at dawn, his voice ragged with anger. "They slashed my tires," he said. "Every one of them. Left a note under the wiper. Said Walker won't save you." I clenched the phone so tight, my knuckles ached. They weren't just after me anymore. They were targeting anyone who stood beside me. It should have scared us. Should have made us question whether it was worth it. Instead, it bound us tighter. By the time we marched into that courtroom, we weren't individuals anymore. We were a unit, an entire community standing shoulder to shoulder, fed up and ready to see justice done. Douglas sat there at the defense table, sweat trickling down his temple, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. Margaret was still hiding in the shadows, her name whispered but her face unseen. And when the prosecutor began laying out the evidence, the embezzlement, the kickbacks, the hush money, the intimidation tactics, the silence in that courtroom was deafening. Every word was a nail in the coffin. The judge leaned forward, voice heavy with finality. This court finds sufficient evidence to refer this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. Additionally, this board is hereby stripped of its authority pending further investigation. Cheers erupted behind me. Grown men hugged. Women cried. Harris let out a shout so loud it echoed off the courtroom walls. It wasn't the end, not yet. Criminal trials take time, and Margaret and Douglas would fight tooth and nail to wriggle free. But it was the moment we'd been fighting for. The board had fallen as I stepped outside into the sunlight. Reporters thrust microphones in my face, cameras flashing. "Mr. Walker, how does it feel?" I paused, looking out at the crowd of neighbors who had once been strangers, now bound together by fire. "It feels," I said, like the truth finally won. But deep down, I knew one thing. The fight wasn't truly over until Margaret herself was dragged out of the shadows. And something told me she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Asterisk, asterisk, when the gavel came down and the judge stripped the board of its authority. It felt like the sky itself cracked open. For years, Margaret and her cronies had treated the neighborhood like their personal kingdom. Now the crown had been ripped off, but victories in court are never the end. They're just the beginning of the next fight. Because while Douglas crumbled under the weight of public shame, Margaret remained a ghost. She'd vanished after her resignation. Yet her influence lingered in the whispers, in the threats, in the shadows cast over every homeowner brave enough to resist. And when the district attorney officially announced a criminal investigation into racketeering and fraud, it was Margaret's name that led the list of persons of interest. The hunt was on. Detectives combed through bank records, traced money trails, subpoenaed emails. What they uncovered was staggering. Margaret had created a web of shell companies, landscaping firms, repair services, consulting groups, all funneling HOA money back into her pockets. Every dollar homeowners paid in dues had been another thread in her tapestry of theft. But the real shocker came when investigators tied her to properties outside our neighborhood, a cabin upstate, a condo by the beach, even a rental house 3 counties over, all paid for with stolen funds. She hadn't just been bleeding us dry. She'd been building an empire, and yet, somehow, she stayed one step ahead. Whenever the sheriff's department went to serve papers, she was gone. Her phone numbers were disconnected. Her accounts drained overnight. It was like chasing smoke. Meanwhile, Douglas was cracking. He showed up drunk at community meetings, slurring his words, raging about conspiracies. Neighbors recorded him on their phones as he shouted that he was the real victim, that Margaret had used him as a pawn. It might have been pathetic if it wasn't so dangerous. Because desperate men make rash decisions. One night, as I pulled into my driveway, headlights flared in my rearview mirror. A black SUV roared up behind me, engine growling. Before I could react, it swerved, cutting me off. The driver's door flew open. Tay and Douglas stumbled out, wild-eyed veins bulging in his neck. "You think you've won, Walker?" he screamed. "You don't know what she's capable of." I stepped out slowly, hands raised, trying to keep distance. "Douglas, go home," I said. Voice steady, but he wasn't listening. He staggered closer, jabbing a finger at me. "She burned this whole place to the ground before she goes to jail. You hear me? Burn it. His words weren't just drunken rambling. They were a warning. Margaret wasn't running scared. She was planning something. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to chaos. Mailboxes stuffed with anonymous letters, each one the same. Walker is lying. Walker is costing you everything. Walker will destroy this community. Some letters included doctored photos, my face pasted into crime scenes. Bank statements forged to look like I was the one stealing. It was a smear campaign on steroids. But this time, it didn't work. Neighbors compared notes, realizing every letter was identical, mass-produced. They laughed at the clumsy Photoshop, the absurd accusations. Instead of dividing us, it pulled us closer. They're desperate, Harris told me, shaking his head. This is the death rattle. Still, I couldn't shake Douglas's warning. She burned this whole place to the ground, and then came the fire. It was a Sunday morning when the sirens wailed, echoing across the valley. Thick smoke rose in the distance, a black plume clawing at the sky. We raced toward it, hearts pounding. And when we arrived, horror gripped us all. The HOA clubhouse, the very place Margaret had ruled from for years, was engulfed in flames. Windows shattered from the heat. The roof caved in. Firefighters battled the blaze, but the building was already lost. Neighbors gasped. Some crying, others standing in stunned silence. On the ground, near the back door, investigators later found traces of accelerant. It wasn't an accident. It was arson, and everyone knew who was behind it. Margaret had torched the clubhouse to erase evidence, to send a message, to show she still had power even from the shadows. But in her desperation, she'd made the biggest mistake of all, because fire leaves a trail. Security cameras from a nearby gas station caught her car speeding away from the neighborhood minutes before the blaze. Witnesses placed her in town that morning. The DA now had more than fraud and racketeering. They had arson. The case against her was ironclad. But even with the law closing in, Margaret refused to surrender. Rumors swirled of her hiding out in her lake house, then slipping across state lines, then vanishing into the mountains. Detectives chased every lead, but she stayed a step ahead, like a phantom. Meanwhile, the community was left to pick up the pieces. With the board dissolved, we held emergency meetings in barns, living rooms, even the church basement. We voted to form a temporary committee, not to fine or control, but simply to keep things functioning until new elections could be held. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. Children played without parents, fearing citations for noise. Yards bloomed with individuality, swings, gardens, even a chicken coop. Laughter replaced whispers. It was as if the shackles had been lifted. But I couldn't celebrate it. Not yet. Not while Margaret was still out there one evening. As the sun sank behind the ridge, my phone buzzed with a blocked number. Against my better judgment, I answered. A familiar voice crackled through the line. Cold, sharp. You think you've beaten me, Walker? This isn't over. You ruined everything I built. And I don't forget. Then silence. I stared at the phone. A chill running down my spine. Margaret wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Asterisk, asterisk. The phone call lingered in my ears long after the line went dead. Margaret's voice, cold, venomous, steady, was proof she wasn't some forgotten fugitive. She was still pulling strings, still watching, still dangerous. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat on the porch with a lantern glowing beside me, shotgun across my lap, every creak of the woods setting my nerves on edge. Out here in the mountains, silence could be comforting, or terrifying. And now it felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. By morning, I'd made up my mind. Enough waiting for the law to catch her. Margaret had played the system for years, hiding behind paperwork, fake contracts, and now a trail of fire. If she was going to be stopped, it would take more than subpoenas and court dates. She needed to be cornered. The break came a week later. A neighbor, one who'd kept quiet during most of the fight, knocked on my door. His name was Carl, a quiet, wiry man with sharp eyes. "I probably shouldn't be here," he said, shifting nervously. "But I know where she is." My heart skipped. Carl explained that his cousin ran a small grocery store 3 towns over. A woman had been coming in regularly, always paying in cash, wearing a wig and sunglasses. But the cousin recognized her. The clipped voice, the sharp posture. It was Margaret. "She's been laying low," Carl whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "But she's slipping. She's desperate. That fire wasn't the end. She's planning something bigger." I called Grant, my lawyer, then the detective handling the case. They listened carefully, then told me what I already feared. "She's volatile. Don't approach her yourself." But deep down, I knew the truth. Margaret wasn't just hiding, she was plotting her next move. And if we didn't act, she'd strike again. A few days later, their prediction proved right. The neighborhood awoke to chaos again. Overnight, someone had dumped hundreds of flyers across every driveway and yard. Bright red ink screamed from the pages. "This community is mine. Walker is a fraud. Pay what you owe or pay in blood." It wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was a declaration of war. Parents hustled their kids inside. Harris and a few others gathered in the street, waving the flyers, their faces grim. "She's unhinged," Harris muttered. "If the cops don't get her soon, someone's gonna get hurt." The DA filed for an emergency warrant. Law enforcement tracked Margaret's car, traced her fake businesses, froze her accounts. But every time they got close, she slipped through like smoke. And then, she made her boldest move yet. It was a Friday night when the power went out across the entire neighborhood. Streetlights blinked off. Houses went dark. The mountains fell into eerie silence, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. Then came the sound engines. Multiple neighbors peeked from windows as 3 trucks rolled slowly down the main road. Brights off, shadows shifting in their beds. Figures jumped out, scattering. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. Windows smashed. Tires slashed. Garages broken into. It wasn't random vandalism, it was coordinated. A raid, and at the center of it all, standing tall in the glow of a flashlight beam, was Margaret herself. No wig, no sunglasses. Just her face twisted, furious, defiant. "This is still my neighborhood," she shouted, her voice echoing into the dark. "I built it, I own it. And no one, not Walker, not the courts, not the cops, is taking it from me." Neighbors froze, stunned. Children cried. Harris stormed out with a baseball bat, only to be shoved back by one of Margaret's hired thugs. That's when I stepped forward. My lantern in one hand, shotgun in the other, my voice steady. "It was never yours, Margaret. It was ours. You just stole from it. And tonight, it ends." The street went silent, the air thick with tension. For a heartbeat, I thought she'd order her goons to charge. But then headlights flooded the road. Sirens wailed. The sheriff's department had arrived. Margaret spun, eyes wide with fury and fear, as deputies poured out, weapons drawn. Sheriff's office. Hands where we can see them. Her hired muscles scattered, some tackled to the ground, others disappearing into the woods. Margaret herself tried to run, but 2 deputies were faster. They wrestled her down, her screams echoing like a banshee's wail. "You don't know what you're doing," she shrieked. "This is mine. You'll regret this." But the cuffs clicked shut, and the spell she'd held over us for years finally broke. Neighbors poured into the street. Some cheering, others crying, all watching as Margaret was shoved into the back of a squad car. Douglas, too, was picked up the same night, pulled from his house, still reeking of whiskey for the first time. The board that had ruled like tyrants was truly gone, but even as the taillights disappeared into the night, I felt a strange weight settle in my chest, because victory in the moment doesn't erase the scars left behind. We'd fought for years. We'd endured threats, vandalism, arson, and worse. And though Margaret was finally in chains, the damage she'd done would take far longer to heal. Harris clapped me on the shoulder, his voice rough but steady. "We did it, Walker. You stood up to them." "We all did," I nodded, but my eyes lingered on the darkness beyond the tree line. Because though Margaret was behind bars, her empire had stretched far beyond our little neighborhood, and I couldn't shake the feeling. There were still secrets out there. Still allies of hers who hadn't been caught. This war had ended. But was it the last? Only time would tell. Asterisk the night Margaret was dragged off in handcuffs. The neighborhood felt like it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. We gathered in the streets under the stars. Smoke from burned-out lanterns curling into the air. People hugging, crying, shaking their heads in disbelief. The tyrant was gone. But when the adrenaline faded, reality settled in. Margaret's arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the reckoning. The DA filed a staggering list of charges: racketeering, fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, arson, intimidation, conspiracy. Douglas faced a pile of his own accessory to fraud, aiding and abetting arson, harassment, and perjury. It was the kind of case that made headlines across the state. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. News anchors described our quiet little neighborhood as the center of one of the most shocking HOA scandals in recent memory. And suddenly, my life was no longer private. Cameras showed up at my cabin. Journalists asked for interviews. Some painted me as a hero. Others cast me as a stubborn troublemaker who pushed too far. But I didn't care about headlines. I cared about one thing: justice. The first court date came faster than expected. Margaret and Douglas shuffled in, shackled, wearing orange jumpsuits instead of the pressed suits and smug grins they used to flaunt. For the first time, they weren't in control. The prosecutor laid it all bare: the shell companies, the stolen funds, the hush payments, the clubhouse fire. Witnesses testified. Contractors admitted to being paid double for fake work. Board members confessed to being bribed into silence. But the most damning moment came when Harris took the stand. He stood tall, chest out, voice steady. For years, they bullied us. They threatened us. They stole from us. But we're not victims anymore. We're survivors. And we're here because we refuse to stay silent. The courtroom erupted in applause, before the judge banged his gavel for order. Even the bailiff looked like he wanted to clap. Margaret, meanwhile, glared daggers at me the entire time. Not a hint of remorse. Not a flicker of shame. Just raw hatred. During a recess, she leaned toward the microphone and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "This isn't over," but the jury didn't buy her venom. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came swift and heavy. Guilty on nearly every count. Douglas broke down in tears when the word was read, slumping into his chair, face buried in his hands. Margaret, though, didn't flinch. She stood there, stiff, jaw tight, eyes burning like coals. The judge's sentence was severe. Decades in prison for both. Douglas got less. His cooperation toward the end bought him a lighter sentence. But Margaret? She was gone. A ghost sentenced to spend the rest of her days behind bars. The community erupted in relief. Strangers hugged in the hallways. People wept openly. Reporters snapped photos as if we'd just won a war. And in many ways, we had. But when the cameras left and the courthouse emptied, the quiet settled heavy because wars leave scars. The neighborhood bore them everywhere. Vacant homes abandoned by families who couldn't take the stress anymore. Overgrown yards, fences sagging, playgrounds rusting. The HOA had drained us, not just financially, but spiritually. We held community meetings, real ones, open ones, where every voice mattered. No board lording over us, no threats of fines. Just neighbors, trying to rebuild. Slowly, things began to heal. Kids returned to playing outside. Families fix up their homes, planting gardens, repainting porches. For the first time in years, laughter carried across the streets without fear of a citation. But for me, healing came slower. One evening, I sat alone on my porch, the fire crackling. Stars scattered like diamonds overhead. Harris joined me, setting 2 mugs of coffee on the railing. "You did it," he said. "We did it," I corrected. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, you were the spark. Without you, we'd still be living under her thumb." I wanted to believe him. But deep down, a shadow lingered. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. This isn't over. Even locked away, she still haunted me. And then, one morning, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name, scrawled in jagged handwriting. Inside, a single sheet of paper. No words, just a drawing, a cabin in the woods. My cabin, and a flame drawn beneath it. I stared at it for a long time, the paper trembling in my hands. Margaret was in prison. Douglas was too. Their empire had crumbled, so who had sent it? The fight was over, or at least. I thought it was ... the drawing haunted me. My cabin, sketched in uneven lines, flames curling beneath it like a warning. I held it in my hands until my knuckles went white. Until the ink smudged beneath my fingers. Margaret was behind bars. Douglas too. The empire they'd built had crumbled in full view of the law, of the courts, of the entire community. So how could this note exist? Who had sent it? Was it a leftover loyalist, someone who'd benefited from the corruption and still clung to her shadow? Or worse, was Margaret still pulling strings from inside her cell? I reported it, of course. Took it straight to the sheriff. They bagged it as evidence. Promised to analyze the handwriting. Promised to increase patrols near my cabin. But I could see it in their eyes. They weren't sure what to make of it either. And truth be told, I wasn't convinced a patrol car passing once an hour was going to stop what was coming. The first week after the letter, nothing happened. The quiet almost felt normal again. Neighbors started patching fences, repainting mailboxes, hosting cookouts like the nightmare was behind us. But I stayed watchful. Then came the second week. That's when Harris found the dead animal on his porch. A raccoon, throat slit, blood pooled beneath it. Pinned to its fur was a scrap of paper that read, "You can't hide behind Walker." The sheriff came out again. Cameras flashing, deputies combing the property. But whoever had left it behind was long gone. The third week, the threats grew bolder. Tires slashed. Windows cracked. Graffiti sprayed on fences. Long live the board. Whoever was doing this wasn't just targeting me anymore. They were targeting all of us. It felt like the ghost of Margaret's regime had crawled out of the grave and was clawing at our throats at the next emergency meeting in the barn. Neighbors gathered, tense and fearful. Voices trembled, anger spilled. Some argued about whether to leave the community entirely. Then Harris stood, his voice booming over the chatter. "We've been through worse," he said. "They think they can scare us back into silence. They think they can drag us into the past. But we beat them once. And we'll beat whatever this is, too." The room erupted with murmurs of agreement. But the fear was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat with my shotgun again, lantern flickering on the porch, eyes scanning the tree line. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a branch made me tense. And then, just after midnight, I saw it. A shadow moving between the trees. I froze, heart pounding, hand tightening on the gun. The figure crept closer, cautious, deliberate. Finally, I stood and shouted, "Stop right there." The figure froze. For a long moment, silence. Then, they ran. I fired a warning shot into the air, the blast echoing through the valley. The figure disappeared into the woods, swallowed by darkness. Deputies searched the next morning, but found nothing. Just footprints in the mud. Leading to the road, whoever it was had gotten away. But they'd been watching. Close, too close. Days later, the sheriff finally called me with results. The handwriting on the cabin drawing. It didn't match Margaret or Douglas. It matched someone else, a name I didn't recognize, Stephen Cole. Turns out, he was one of Margaret's contractors, a man who'd collected thousands in fake repair fees, who'd sent in padded invoices and cashed checks signed by Margaret herself. He hadn't been indicted yet, not enough evidence to tie him directly into the scheme, but he was on the DA's radar, and now, seemed, he was on mine. The deputies said they'd pick him up for questioning. But deep down, I knew men like Stephen. He wasn't going to sit quietly in an interrogation room. He was going to lash out. The night after the call, Harris came to stay at my cabin. "You shouldn't be alone out here," he said. "Not with Cole running around." We sat by the fire. Two old fighters, too stubborn to back down, watching the woods like sentries. Hours passed in silence. Then, just before dawn, we heard it, the crack of a branch. The rustle of leaves. Harris raised his bat. I raised the shotgun, and from the tree line, figure emerged, not Stephen Cole. "A deputy Walker," he called, raising a hand. "We got him." Cole's in custody. Relief washed over me, my knees almost buckling. The deputy continued, voice steady. He confessed. Said Margaret promised him protection. Said he was just finishing her work. From prison. I asked, stunned. The deputy nodded grimly. She still had people on the outside. Loyalists, but with Cole down? "We think the chain is broken." I wanted to believe him. I really did, but as the sun rose over the mountains, casting light across my battered cabin and the scarred neighborhood beyond, I knew better. Margaret's shadow would linger for years, maybe forever. Some scars don't fade, but one thing was certain. We weren't victims anymore. Not me, not Harris. Not any of us. We had stood up, we had fought back. And we had won. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. Because when a community finally breaks its chains, it doesn't go back to kneeling. Not ever again. Asterisk in the weeks that followed Stephen Cole's arrest. A new kind of quiet settled over the neighborhood. Not the tense, watchful quiet that had defined the years under Margaret's reign. Not the brittle, suffocating silence of fear. This was something else. It was the kind of quiet you get when people finally exhale after holding their breath for too long. The kind that feels like healing. Neighbors came together in ways I'd never seen before. Harris led volunteer crews to clean up the park, repaint the benches, and fix the swings. Families planted gardens in front yards that had once been neglected. Kids filled the streets with laughter again, riding bikes without anyone keeping tally of HOA-approved hours. The fear wasn't gone completely. Scars like ours don't disappear overnight. Every creak of a floorboard still made me glance at the window. Every letter in the mailbox still made my pulse quicken. But the chains had been broken. And even if the echoes of Margaret's tyranny still haunted us, we were free. The county moved quickly, too. The judge dissolved the HOA entirely. All fines were forgiven, all liens reversed. Homes that had been threatened with foreclosure were saved. And the court appointed a watchdog group to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. It felt surreal. I'd gone from being the man fined $19,000 for a cabin outside their jurisdiction to the man who'd helped dismantle one of the most corrupt HOAs the state had ever seen. But it hadn't come without cost. My cabin had become a symbol, and symbols attract attention. Reporters still drove up the winding dirt road, asking for interviews. Documentarians pitched me exclusive rights to my story. Even podcasters wanted in. Some nights I thought about saying yes, about cashing in on the madness. But when I sat on the porch with Harris, sipping coffee under the stars, I knew the story wasn't mine alone. It belonged to all of us, the ones who stayed, the ones who left, and the ones who fought. So I stayed quiet. One evening, months later, I got a letter in the mail. This time, not a threat. It was from the DA's office. Inside was a notice. Restitution checks were being issued. Margaret's seized assets were being liquidated, and victims of her fraud would finally be repaid. It wasn't much. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. Nothing compared to what we'd lost in years of stress, fear, and stolen peace of mind. But it was something. A tangible reminder that justice had teeth. I remember walking down to the park the next day, check in hand, and seeing neighbors gathered around a picnic table, smiling, laughing. Someone was grilling. Someone else had brought lemonade. It wasn't a celebration of money. It was a celebration of survival, and for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. But then, late one night, I couldn't sleep. The crickets sang, the air was still, the stars scattered bright above. I stepped outside to clear my head, and there, sitting on my porch railing, was another envelope. This one wasn't jagged or threatening. No flames, no drawings, just one word on the front, written in careful block letters, truth. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy image of Margaret in prison blues. Not in court, not in a mugshot. This was different. She was smiling, and sitting across from her, on the other side of the visitation glass, was a man I didn't recognize. The back of the photo was blank. I stared at it for a long time. The air around me suddenly colder. Was it staged? A joke? Some leftover echo of the chaos? Or was it something else entirely? I'll never know for certain. But one thing became clear in that moment. Evil doesn't disappear just because you lock it away. Sometimes it waits. It schemes. It finds new cracks to seep through. And maybe, just maybe, Margaret wasn't finished. I folded the photo, slid it back into the envelope, and tossed it into the fire. Flames curled around the edges, devouring the image until nothing but ash remained, because whether she smiled behind bars or whispered threats from the grave, she no longer owned me. She no longer owned us. We'd taken back our homes, our streets, our lives, and no matter what shadows lingered, no matter what ghosts tried to crawl back into the light, we were free. And freedom, once claimed, is something no board, no tyrant, and no corrupt queen can ever truly take away. And that, my friends, is the story of how a $19,000 fine for a cabin spiraled into the fight of a lifetime. A fight against greed, against corruption, against fear. A fight that proved one simple truth. When ordinary people stand together, even the most powerful empires can fall. And sometimes, that's the only way they ever do. Asterisk, asterisk. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you in the next one. Peace out.